Cold salt on your lips, diesel in the air, a gray sheet of water slapping the side of a boat. Now compare that surface to a meadow. A real meadow, crossed by rivers, edged with marsh, thick in places with woodland, and once dry enough that people could walk across it. That is the first shock of this story. The North Sea feels final to you because you were born after the flood was complete. But there was a time when the sea stood about 120 meters lower than it does now, and the floor beneath those waves was land. Broad land. A vast low country linking Britain to mainland Europe. Not a narrow strip or some miserable, muddy passage. A place you could have lived in. And that changes everything. Because once you stop picturing it as a bridge, you have to ask a harder question. What kind of world was it? The answer is stranger, and honestly, more moving than most people expect. This was rich country. Rivers cut through it. Marsh spread across the low ground. Woodland rose where the soil held. Mammoths moved there in the older cold phases, and later, aurochs and red deer roamed it. For Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, this was not empty space between destinations. It was a homeland, a place of routes, shelter, memory, food, and repetition. The kind of landscape where people learn where the water sits after rain, where animals cross at dawn, where dry ground lasts longest when the weather turns. Before we get there, hold on to that word, homeland. Because the next layer of the mystery is not that this place existed. It vanished so completely, most people never hear its name. From about 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, rising meltwater seas kept pushing inward, slowly drowning that low plain bit by bit. Coast became wetland. Wetland became inlet. Ground became island. And then, around 8,200 years ago, after a submarine landslide off Norway, a tsunami crossed the last low remnants. So here is the real puzzle. If an entire human world can go under like that, what else have we mistaken for permanent simply because we arrived late? If you like evidence-heavy mysteries like this, subscribe now, because the way scientists brought this drowned country back is even more unsettling. And once you let that question in, the map in your head starts to fail. You stop seeing the North Sea as a fixed blue shape on a wall chart, and you begin to feel how misleading modern coastlines can be. Back in the Ice Age world, when the sea stood about 120 meters lower, this was a broad lowland joining them. Not a causeway you hurried across, but ground with space in it. Space for rivers to wander, for marsh to spread, for woodland to thicken where the soil allowed it. The place had depth, texture, weather, seasons. If you had stood there under a cold morning sky, boots in damp earth, you would not have thought, I'm crossing between regions. You would have thought, I'm here. That matters more than it seems, because the moment you call it a bridge, you reduce it to function. You make it a corridor. But this was not a corridor. It was rich country. Mammoths moved across it in earlier times, and later, aurochs and red deer lived there too. Water would have flashed silver between reeds. Mud would have held tracks. Wind would have moved through low trees and wet grass. For Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, that kind of land is not empty. It is useful in 100 quiet ways. Food, shelter, roots, lookout points, memory. The difference between passing through a place and belonging to it is hard to measure on a map, but it is everything. Before we get to the drowning, stay with that for a second. Imagine knowing where the ground stays firm after rain. Imagine knowing which bend of a river gives you fish, which patch of brush hides deer, Which stretch floods first when the season turns? That is what was at stake here. Not just land in the abstract, but repeated human knowledge tied to a living surface. And then the next layer darkens the whole picture. Because from about 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, rising meltwater seas did not simply erase the place all at once. They changed it in stages, slowly enough that people could adapt, and maybe slowly enough that adaptation itself became part of the trap. A shoreline that moves a little does not feel like the end of a world. At first. At first, it would have felt manageable. That is the unsettling part. When water takes a little more ground each season, the world does not announce, "This is collapse." It says something softer. It says, "Move the camp a bit higher." It says, "The old crossing is unreliable now." It says, "The river mouth tastes different." And for the people living on that low country, that may have been how the loss arrived, not as one clean break, but as a series of adjustments so ordinary they could almost pass for weather. You can picture it: wet soil where dry earth used to hold, reeds spreading into places that once stayed open, a track used by generations turning to mud underfoot, a channel widening quietly year after year. The smell changes too: less leaf mold, more salt on the wind. Water that once ran clear inland begins to carry a different edge. And still, life goes on. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers would have known how to adapt better than most modern people ever will. They knew how to read ground, how to shift with animal paths, how to live close to rivers and marsh. Before we go further, that matters. Adaptation is not weakness. It is skill. It is intelligence tied to place. But there is a darker side to it. The better you are at adjusting, the longer you can stay inside a changing world without naming what is happening to you. You reroute. You relocate. You return to what remains. And because each change is survivable, the whole process can hide its true scale. That is how a homeland becomes a coast. The drowned plain would not have vanished as a single shape. It would have broken apart unevenly. Some ground stayed useful longer, some flooded early. Rivers cut the land into pieces. Marsh widened. Dry ridges became more precious. What had once been interior space began to feel exposed, edged by water, vulnerable in new directions. A place that once connected people now started separating them. And this is where the mystery grows sharper, not simpler. Because if the loss was gradual enough, then memory itself changed inside it. One generation remembers a route on foot. The next remembers a boat crossing. The next remembers only open water beyond the reeds. And somewhere in that long retreat, the land stopped being one place at all. And once it broke apart like that, the place changed in a more intimate way than a map can show. A broad homeland can absorb change. An island cannot. On a wide lowland, you can move inland when water pushes in. You can shift along a river. You can leave one wet area and trust that dry ground still waits beyond it. But when the same land becomes scattered pieces, every retreat costs more. A lost path is no longer a detour. It is a separation. A flooded meadow is no longer inconvenience. It is the edge of your world moving closer. You can almost feel the difference under your feet. The air would have turned sharper with salt. Water birds would gather where brush once stood. Ground that used to dry after a few bright days might stay slick and black, holding pools that reflected the sky like broken glass. The old center of life becomes shoreline. The safe interior becomes exposure. For people living there, the meaning of distance itself changes. A place that was once half a day away by foot may now lie across a channel, cold and uncertain, beyond reeds and tide. Before the final blow, notice what is happening here. This is not only geography shrinking, it is certainty shrinking. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers knew how to read land with extraordinary precision, but the land itself was changing shape beneath that knowledge. The same skill that once made the country feel familiar now had to be used defensively, to predict flooding, to choose higher ground, to judge which routes were still trustworthy and which had become traps. So this story cuts so deep. You are not looking at a simple flood tale. You are looking at a long unmaking. The drowned plane did not vanish from the outside in like paint washing off a board. It was transformed from within, split by water, softened by marsh, narrowed into remnants. And the people who stayed did not wake one morning to discover they were living in ruins. They kept living, which may be the hardest part to imagine. Then comes the next layer, because for a long time, all of this would still have been survivable. Reduced, yes. Fragmented, yes. But still inhabited. And that is exactly what made what happened around 8,200 years ago so devastating. By then, survival on the remaining ground may have depended on one assumption: that tomorrow would still resemble yesterday. That is what makes the next turn so chilling. The long drowning had trained people to expect change in slow motion. Water crept, marsh spread, routes failed one by one. Even when the losses were painful, they were still legible. You could smell the salt before it reached a stream. You could see reeds taking over open ground. You could test mud with the heel of your foot and decide not to camp there again. The place was shrinking, yes, but it was still a place you could read. And then the sea prepared something that could not be read that way. Around 8,200 years ago, off Norway, a huge submarine landslide known as Storegga sent a tsunami outward across the water. This matters because the last survivors of this low country were no longer living on a broad inland world. They were on reduced ground. Low islands, exposed edges, remnants already thinned by rising meltwater seas. A wave striking a continent is one kind of danger. A wave striking fragments is another. There is less height to flee to, less room for error, less time to misunderstand what you are seeing. Before we picture that moment, pause on the cruel geometry of it. The danger began far away, underwater, beyond any human horizon. No smoke, no shaking earth beneath camp, no warning carried by rumor from the next valley. If you were standing on one of those last pieces of land, the morning might have felt ordinary. Damp grass, cold air in the chest, birds lifting off the marsh. And then the sea itself would begin acting wrong. Maybe the shoreline would pull back in a way no tide had taught them to expect. Maybe channels would empty strangely. Maybe fish would flash on wet sand where water should still be. The terrible thing is that the same landscape knowledge that helped people survive the slow unmaking offered little help here. Because this was not the usual sea anymore. This was energy arriving from a collapse they could not see. And it was not only how big the wave was. The question is what it meant to people already living on the last thin margin of a vanishing world. Just as the water started to move. If you try to stay inside that moment, the fear comes from confusion first, not impact. The people on those last scraps of land would have known tides, wind shifts, storm water, marsh flooding. They would have known the ordinary moods of that coast, the way you know the rooms of your own home in the dark. But this was different. A sea that suddenly pulls away is not behaving like weather. A channel that empties too fast is not following the rules you learned from childhood. The same sharp attention that had helped people survive the long retreat may, for a few terrible moments, have only deepened the mystery. They would have seen that something was wrong before they understood what wrong meant. And that matters, because this was not one more adjustment, one more camp moved uphill, one more route abandoned to reeds and salt. The ground that remained was already low, already narrowed by centuries of water pressing in. Fresh water, dry footing, shelter from exposure, all of it had become more precious. So when the Storegga tsunami crossed those final islands, the danger was not only the force of water, it was what happened after. Salt where fresh water had been, debris where camps had stood, familiar edges cut apart again. Before we go any farther, hold on to that distinction. The dramatic image is the wave. The deeper wound is what a wave does to a world already weakened. A broad homeland can absorb damage in ways a fragment cannot. But these were fragments now, thin margins, a place where every loss touched the next one. If marsh is spoiled, game changes. If a crossing is broken, people separate. If low ground is washed through, memory itself loses its anchors. The old tree line, the usual bank, the place where you used to stop. So this event mattered. The harder question is how it mattered. Did it erase the last remaining communities at once? Did it drive survivors away from places that no longer made sense to stay in? Did it turn the final stage of retreat into something irreversible? The evidence cannot give us a spoken witness. No one left a sentence saying, "The sea came wrong." What it gives us instead is stranger than a witness, because the mud remembered. And that is where the story becomes even stranger, because the witness that survives is not human at all. It is mud. Cold, compacted, layered mud lying under the North Sea, where the old ground was buried rather than simply erased. If that sounds disappointing, stay with me, because this is the part where the vanished place stops being just a dramatic idea and starts becoming something science can actually read. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to bring shape back to what water took away. Think about what happens when a landscape settles into sediment. Tiny grains fall, plant traces sink, bits of organic matter are sealed away. Year after year, layer after layer, the place leaves behind a quiet record of itself. And when scientists pull up seabed sediment cores, they are not just sampling dirt. They are lifting a vertical slice of lost ground, like cutting through a cake and seeing each thin band of time held in place. Darker layer, lighter layer. Shell fragments here, peat-like material there. The texture changes in the hand. The smell can change too. Mineral salt above, older earth below. Before we get to what those layers reveal, notice how different this is from the way most people imagine the past. You do not need a standing wall or a carved monument for a world to leave evidence. A drowned marsh can remember. A buried river edge can remember. Even a forest that vanished underwater can still leave signals behind so fine you would miss them if you blinked. That is where pollen enters the story. And then, even more remarkably, sediment DNA. Tiny traces locked in those layers can tell scientists what kinds of plants once grew there, what sort of habitat spread across the old lowland, and by extension, what kind of living world sustained the people who knew it. Physical evidence drawn from the place itself, not fantasy or guesswork dressed up as romance. So the next layer of the mystery is no longer, did this world exist? It is this. If the mud still carries the memory of woodland, marsh, and life, how much of that vanished country can we actually rebuild from a tube of seabed and a handful of grains? And this is where the drowned place starts to come back in pieces. Of course, it returns the hard way, through traces so small they would dust your fingertip and vanish. In those seabed sediment cores, pollen grains survive like tiny sealed messages. Each one came from a real plant that once released it into the air above that lost ground. Wind carried it, water settled it, mud covered it, and time pressed it down. Now, when those layers are examined, a vanished surface begins to sharpen. That matters because pollen does something beautifully stubborn. It refuses to let a landscape stay abstract. Instead of some old land, you begin to get woodland, marsh, wetter phases, drier patches, habitat, not slogan. The country under the North Sea stops being a blank in-between zone and turns back into living terrain. You can almost smell it again. Damp earth near water, cut reeds, leaf litter in the shade, open wet places where animals had room to move. Then, the next layer goes even further. Sediment DNA can preserve traces from the old environment too. Not a full scene, not a perfect snapshot, but enough to strengthen the picture that this was rich country. The plants were there. The wet ground was there. The woods were there. And if that living setting existed, then the people who used it were not wandering through emptiness. They were moving through a world with structure, with recurring resources, with places worth returning to. Before we get too comfortable, notice what this does to the mystery. It changes the question from, was this possible, to, how much of daily life can a buried landscape still reveal? Because once forests and marshes begin to reappear in evidence, the human story presses closer. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers did not live separate from that ecology. They depended on it, read it, and shaped their movements around it. So when a core tells you there was woodland here, it is telling you about more than trees. It is telling you there may have been shelter nearby, game trails nearby, familiar ground nearby, and perhaps people close enough that the next thing hidden under the sea is not just a habitat, but the outline of a homeland with human footsteps in it. And once human footsteps start to enter that picture, the loss becomes harder to keep at a distance. A wetland is not just reeds and shallow water if people knew how to use it. Woodland is not only a line of trees if it gave cover, fuel, tools, and familiar paths. A river is not simply a feature on a reconstructed map if it marked where you returned, where you waited, where you expected life to gather. That is what the evidence from this buried landscape begins to do. It does not hand us names. It does not give us voices. But it restores the stage on which those lives made sense. That matters because Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were not floating above the land as vague, prehistoric people. They were tied to exact places in exact ways. Fresh water mattered. Dry ridges mattered. Open ground near marsh mattered. If the old lowland held woodland, animal movement, and usable edges between wet and dry, then it held the kind of structure people build memory around. Memory, not monuments. The turn where the river bends. The place where tracks gather in soft mud. The patch of higher ground where smoke does not cling too long in the morning air. Before we get to what science can and cannot say, stay with that thought. Most human lives leave almost nothing behind. No writing, no carved stone, no biography. And yet, those lives were not small from the inside. To the people living there, this place was not a prelude to later history. It was the center, their center. That is why the drowning of this world matters beyond curiosity. When the water kept advancing, it was not swallowing empty terrain. It was taking routes people trusted, camp places people returned to, and the quiet certainty that the land tomorrow would still be legible. Then came the wave, and whatever remained after that would have been even more fragile, not just physically, but mentally. A world stops feeling like home before it disappears completely. And now the next question becomes sharper than ever. If the mud can restore forests, marsh, and the shape of the land itself, can it also tell us how close people stayed to the edge right up until the last ground began to fail? And that is exactly where the science has to become careful. Because there is a real temptation, once you feel the human weight of this place, to start filling in too much. To imagine a final campfire, a final crossing, a final family looking back at the water. But the evidence does not work like that. This lost country reaches us in fragments, habitat clues, layers of buried ground, signals of marsh and woodland, traces of long environmental change, and the memory of sudden violence carried in sediment. That is enough to say something powerful. It is not enough to invent a neat last scene. What the buried record can do is narrower, and in a way more haunting. It can show that the land was good. It can show that it supported rivers, wet ground, and woods. It can show that people had every reason to know it closely. And then it can show that the same place was steadily transformed by water until almost nothing remained. That combination matters. A poor place being lost is one kind of story. A rich, inhabited one being reduced piece by piece is another. Before we go further, notice how the mystery has changed shape again. At the start, the shock was geographical. There was land under the North Sea. Then it became ecological. That land was alive and useful. Then it became human. People belonged there. Now it becomes forensic. How do you tell the difference between ordinary change and a blow that truly altered the fate of the last survivors? That is where the older drowning and the later wave have to be held together at the same time. The long rise of the sea had already broken the lowland apart. The tsunami did not arrive on an untouched world. It struck what was left. And that means the question is not whether one event or the other caused the end, as if history were tidy. The question is how a slow unmaking and a sudden shock can combine until a homeland no longer functions as a homeland. You can feel how modern that problem is, can't you? Not because the details match our world exactly, but because the pattern does. People endure change. They adjust. They stay longer than outsiders think they should. And then something happens that reveals how narrow their margin had become all along. The next layer is how scientists read that narrowed margin from the seabed itself. And the seabed does answer that question, just not in the way a listener might expect. It does not give you a village plan. It does not give you a row of houses, a painted map, or a final diary line from the people who stayed too long. What it gives instead is something more stubborn than drama. It gives you pattern. Layer against layer, signal against signal, the buried ground begins to show where the place stayed fresh, where it turned wetter, where woodland held, where marsh expanded, and where the old land was gradually losing its balance. That matters because human presence does not float free from those conditions. If you know where the firm ground is, where fresh water lasts, where cover grows, where animals return, you know where people could keep returning too. As a practical truth, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived through attention to exactly those details. A low ridge above wet ground is not just scenery. A sheltered edge between woodland and open water is not just pretty. In a shrinking landscape, those become the difference between a usable world and one that is slipping out of your hands. Before we get to the hardest implication, notice how eerie this kind of knowledge is. You are reconstructing human nearness without seeing a face. You are inferring memory from ecology. A patch of woodland here, marsh there, a corridor of movement between them. And suddenly the place begins to feel occupied, even when no voice survives. The old country becomes less anonymous with every environmental clue. And that is where the emotional pressure builds. Because the better this world is reconstructed, the less easy it becomes to call it a mere land bridge. The rivers mattered. The wet ground mattered. The woods mattered. The gradual invasion of water mattered. Then the Storegga wave matters differently too, because it did not strike blank geography. It struck the last workable arrangement of a real living place. So now the question sharpens again. If the environment can be rebuilt this closely from pollen and buried traces, then the final phase of loss may also be readable in unusual detail. Not who spoke, not what they called the place, but how the land itself began telling them sooner and sooner that staying there was becoming impossible. And that is the detail that changes this from a vanished landscape into a human problem you can almost feel in your own body. A place does not become impossible all at once. First, it becomes harder to predict. The stream you trusted tastes faintly wrong. The ground that used to dry by noon stays dark and slick. Wind carries more salt. Marsh reaches farther inland. A route still exists, but only if you time it well. Then only in good weather. Then not at all. On a broad map, those look like minor adjustments. Inside a lived world, they are warnings. That is why the long rise of the sea matters so much. The drowning was not only about land area shrinking, it was about reliability shrinking. For people who lived by reading surfaces, edges, water, and animal movement, reliability was everything. If you lose certainty about where dry ground will hold, where fresh water will stay sweet, where animals will return, then the country is not just smaller, it is less knowable. And a place that becomes less knowable becomes less safe, even before it disappears. Before we go further, pause on that. The old lowland had once linked distant regions. Later, it held communities on its remaining workable ground. But in the final stages, the same world that once invited movement may have begun trapping it. A route across firm earth becomes a crossing by water. A crossing by water becomes risky. A risky route becomes a broken connection. Little by little, a homeland starts behaving like a border. That is what makes the wave so important. Without needing to make it magical, the sea had already been teaching people that the margins were narrowing. Then the Storegga tsunami struck those narrowed margins, the last low islands, the last usable edges, the last arrangement that still allowed life to function there in a familiar way. And the more closely you imagine that final arrangement, the more a chilling possibility begins to emerge. Maybe the true ending was not the moment the water covered the last ground. Maybe it was earlier. The moment the people still there understood that the place they knew had already stopped behaving like home. And that possibility changes the emotional center of the whole story. Because once you see it that way, the final loss is not only about water covering land. It is about a slower rupture that may have happened earlier, inside daily life. A homeland does not need to be fully submerged to stop functioning as a homeland. It only needs to become unreliable often enough. Fresh water turns uncertain. Travel turns risky. Familiar ground turns soft, then tidal, then gone. You can still stand there and already be living in a place that no longer keeps its old promises. That is why this drowned world feels so close, even across thousands of years. You do not need a surviving sentence from the people who lived there to understand the pressure. The ecology tells part of the story. The retreat of the coast tells part of the story. The buried traces of marsh and woodland tell part of the story. And together, they suggest something painfully human. People likely stayed, adjusted, stayed again, and only gradually faced the fact that adjustment itself was becoming a form of loss. Before we go to the wider consequences, notice what that means for memory. One generation might remember a broad route over firm ground. The next remembers a crossing by water. The next remembers exposed margins and caution. The next, maybe, remembers the place mainly as something that used to be larger. In that sense, the drowning happened twice. First in the landscape, then in the mind. First, the world shrank. Then the idea of it shrank too. And that may be the most haunting thing about Doggerland, the drowned world beneath the North Sea. Not simply that it disappeared, but that it likely became harder and harder to imagine in its former fullness, while people were still living on what remained. The rich country of rivers, marsh, and woodland did not turn into open sea in one clean motion. It narrowed into fragments. It taught its inhabitants new habits of caution. It made them live on edges. Then, around 8,200 years ago, Storegga sent a wave across those edges. So now the next question is bigger than the final flood itself. If this place once linked Britain to mainland Europe, and then slowly broke apart until even memory may have contracted with it, what did its disappearance do to the human map of the world that came after? And that question matters more than it first appears, because the loss of this place did not just remove land, it changed relationships. When the Low Country was still dry, movement between Britain and mainland Europe was not movement across open sea. It was movement through a connected world. Rivers, marsh edges, stretches of firmer ground, woodland corridors, all of that made travel part of the landscape itself. Once the water kept rising, that changed. First the routes narrowed, then they broke. Then the same geography that once linked people began to sort them into separate margins. You can feel the difference if you imagine the ground under your own feet changing meaning. A path is one thing when it leads onward through country you know. It becomes something else when it ends at water. A water crossing is one thing when it is occasional. It becomes something else when it is constant, exposed, and less predictable each season. In that sense, the drowning did not only redraw the coast, it redrew the human map. Who could reach whom? How often? With what risk? And under what conditions? Before we go further, stay with that word, separation. Britain did not begin, in lived human terms, as an unquestioned island cut off by a fixed sea. It became more island-like as this old lowland withdrew beneath the water. That is a huge change. Socially, too. Fewer crossings mean fewer easy returns. Fewer returns mean weaker familiarity. Weaker familiarity means a different sense of distance, and eventually, a different sense of belonging. And that is where this story starts pressing against the present. Because what looks permanent to you, the coastline on a map, the boundary between one region and another, may simply be the shape left behind by an older environmental loss. You inherit the aftermath and call it normal. You inherit the water and forget the road. That may be one of the deepest lessons hidden in this drowned world. The lines people later treat as natural are sometimes just the scars of a vanished landscape. But what comes next is even more unsettling than that. Because if a whole connected country can disappear so completely that later generations accept the replacement coastline as if it had always been there, then the strangest part of the story is not only the drowning, it is the forgetting. And forgetting, in a story like this, is what time does when the ground itself is gone. If a coastline changes before writing, before maps, before anyone leaves you a sentence saying, "There used to be a country here," then the sea gets the final word for a very long time. Later people inherit the water, inherit the islands, inherit the channels, and assume that this is simply how the world is arranged. The replacement landscape feels ancient because it is the only one they have ever known. The lost one falls out of reach. That is why this story is so unsettling. Not only because a whole human world went under, but because it went under cleanly enough in cultural memory that most of us grow up never suspecting it. You are taught coasts as if they were facts, not events. You are shown the sea as a boundary, not as a covering. You look at a map and think permanence. But a map can be an afterimage. A border can be a floodline that outlived the people who crossed it on foot. Before we go further, hold on to that thought. The people who lived there likely did not experience themselves as standing at the edge of prehistory, waiting to become a submerged mystery. They were simply living in their world while it narrowed around them. Then their world disappeared, and with it disappeared the easiest path to remembering that it had ever been there in full. That is where the science becomes almost an act of recovery against silence. Recovery. Pollen, old buried surfaces, traces locked in mud. These do not just tell us that the lowland existed. They challenge the arrogance of the modern shoreline. They say, very quietly, that your sense of what is normal may depend on a catastrophe old enough to be invisible. And once you accept that, the North Sea changes in your mind again. It stops looking like empty water over anonymous ground. It starts looking like a cover placed over a forgotten chapter. Not a mythic chapter, a human one. Which leads to the next question. If memory failed and the sea concealed the evidence, what brought this drowned country back into view at all? And the answer is almost fittingly indirect. This place did not return to human awareness because someone found a standing ruin or uncovered a buried town square. It came back the same way it had been hidden, in pieces. A landscape this thoroughly drowned does not reveal itself dramatically. It leaks clues. A shape in the seabed, a layer that should not be there, ancient plant traces sealed under marine mud. One sign by itself means little. Then another appears. Then another. And suddenly, the empty water begins to look less empty. That matters because rediscovery, in this case, is not romance. It is pattern recognition. The old lowland was invisible for so long partly because the modern sea does such a convincing job of seeming final. Flat horizon, gray water, wind, depth. Your mind accepts the surface and stops there. But once evidence starts accumulating, the illusion breaks. The seabed is no longer just bottom. It becomes a buried topography. Former channels, former wet ground, former habitable land. Before we get to what that means emotionally, notice how strange this is as a way of recovering history. Usually, when people think of the past, they imagine walls, bones, tools, something you can hold up to the light. Here, much of the recovery begins with environmental traces and submerged form. Not, here is the lost world in one clean piece, but here is one more reason to believe the lost world had shape, life, and continuity. The case builds quietly, and because it builds quietly, it ends up being more persuasive. You can almost feel the mental shift happen. First, you learn there was once land. Then, you realize it was rich land. Then, you understand people belong to it. Then the evidence under the North Sea starts to give that belonging physical depth again. The water that once erased the place now sits above the record of it. And that is where the story starts bending back toward you. Because once a drowned country can be recovered from buried traces, the sea stops being just scenery. It becomes archive. The next layer is the most powerful one yet, that scientists can prove the place existed and can begin to rebuild its vanished forests so clearly that the people moving through them start to feel almost present again. And once that shift happens, the recovery of this place starts to feel almost unnervingly intimate. Because rebuilding vanished forests is not just a botanical exercise. It is a way of putting walls back around human experience, living ones. Stands of trees that blocked wind, wet ground that held birds and fish, firmer ridges where people could pause, watch, work, and return. When traces in the buried record show woodland, marsh, and changing water, they are also sketching the conditions of daily thought. Where it felt safe to stop, where it felt exposed, where a route made sense. That matters because the old lowland was never only scenery, it was structure. A rich country gives you options. It gives you alternative paths when one area floods. It gives you different foods in different seasons. It gives you places to move toward, not just away from. So when the evidence beneath the sea starts restoring that richness, it restores something more than ecology. It restores a kind of human confidence. The confidence that a landscape can still answer your needs if you know it well enough. Before we get to the darker side of that, stay with the beauty of the reconstruction for a second. The water overhead today looks flat, cold, and finished. But under it, the record says otherwise. It says there were woods here once, wet ground here, freshwater spaces here. It says the drowned plain was textured, varied, alive. And because of that, the people who moved through it were not clinging to barren scraps from the beginning. They were living in a world that had depth, resource, and familiarity, which makes the long retreat more painful, not less. A poor place can be abandoned. A good place is harder to leave. The better a land works for you, the longer you try to make it work again. You shift camp. You relearn crossings. You trust one more season. That is the trap hidden inside abundance. The very richness of the place may have encouraged people to remain through stages of loss that, from the outside, we might imagine should have driven them away sooner. And that leads straight to the next layer of the mystery. If this country was valuable enough to hold people close for so long, then the final story is not only about drowning. It is about why humans stay with a changing world until the changing world stops loving them back. And that may be the most uncomfortable part of the whole mystery. Not that the land changed, but that people were good enough at adapting to remain inside the change for so long. A place with rivers, marsh, and woodland gives you reasons to stay. It keeps offering one more answer. If one route floods, another may still work. If one patch turns brackish, fresh water may still lie farther in. If open ground narrows, woodland cover may still hold. Rich country delays surrender. It teaches endurance. And for the people living there, that endurance would not have felt foolish. It would have felt normal, necessary, loyal even, to the place that had fed them for generations. That is why the long retreat of this lowland feels so human. People rarely leave at the first sign of trouble. They move a little, they adjust, they return. The world becomes less generous, then less predictable, then less forgiving. But by then, memory is already invested in it. The old ground is still where your paths are, still where your habits make sense, still where the shape of life feels known. Even when the edges start failing, the center of your mind may lag behind the center of the map. Before the final emotional turn, stay with that image. Attachment first. The same richness that once made this place a homeland may also have made it harder to abandon. A poor margin is easy to classify as temporary. A fertile, varied country is not. You trust it longer. You forgive it more. You interpret warning signs as interruptions, not endings. And then comes the cruel reversal. The better you know a place, the more each change hurts. The marsh spreads where you remember dry footing. Salt reaches where you remember sweet water. A route becomes a risk. A crossing becomes a gamble. The land does not vanish from memory all at once. It begins contradicting memory, one familiar detail at a time. That is where the story turns back toward you. Because once you understand that this drowned world was lost not only through water, but through the slow breaking of trust between people and place, a new question starts to press in. If that trust can fail so gradually that a homeland becomes unlivable before it becomes invisible, then what does this sunken country really say about the coastlines we trust now? And that is the moment when the old story stops being safely prehistoric. Because once you see what happened here, you can no longer treat a coastline as a permanent fact with a neat line around it. This drowned country forces a harder truth on you. The map you inherit is not the whole story. It is only the latest arrangement of water and memory. Before it, there was another. Before that, another still. And one of those arrangements held rivers, marsh, woodland, and people living ordinary lives on land that now lies under gray water. That matters because the loss of this place was not theatrical from the inside. It was practical, repeated, seasonal, then structural. The sea rose, fresh ground narrowed, crossing points failed. The last remnants became more exposed. Then the Storegga wave struck a world already reduced. If you only focus on the final drowning, you miss the more important lesson. Catastrophe can arrive as a long negotiation before it arrives as a blow. A homeland can be under pressure for generations before it is gone enough for outsiders to call it lost. Before the final emotional turn, pause on what that means for the way humans judge danger. We tend to notice what is sudden. We build memory around impact. But this buried world teaches almost the opposite. What changes people most may be the slow reorganization of the ordinary, the root that stops working, the water that changes taste, the ground that never quite dries the way it used to. By the time the dramatic event comes, the deeper transformation may already be well underway. That is why this place reaches forward into your own life so easily. Not because your world is identical to theirs, it is not, but because the pattern is familiar. We live inside environments, and as long as those environments remain usable, we call them stable. We adjust to warning signs. We normalize narrowing margins. We rename loss as inconvenience, until something finally makes the scale impossible to ignore. And maybe that is the most unsettling gift this drowned land offers. It does not only ask you to imagine a vanished past. It asks whether the places you trust now feel permanent because they are permanent, or because you have not yet lived long enough to see what they are becoming. And that question brings you right up against the real lesson of this lost country. A lesson more about timing than doom, exactly. A place can still function while it is failing. People can still eat there, sleep there, move through it, even love it there, while the deeper conditions that made it dependable are slipping away underneath them. That is what this lowland seems to show with unusual clarity. First, it was broad and rich. Then it was reduced, then fragmented, then struck. At every stage, life may still have been possible for a while. That, for a while, is where the human story lives. Because nobody experiences a changing world as a graph. You experience it as one more wet season, one more difficult crossing, one more patch of ground that doesn't feel the same underfoot. You smell more salt. You notice the reeds farther in. You learn a new route, then another. The mind is built to keep going, to adapt, to make the present livable. That is a strength, and sometimes it is also what keeps you from recognizing how much has already been lost. Before the final reveal this story is moving toward, stay with that tension. The people of this place were not passive victims waiting to be erased by water. They were active readers of land and weather. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers would have been highly skilled at adjusting to shifting conditions. But skill does not cancel change. It only buys time inside it. And time, in a story like this, can be merciful for a generation and merciless across many. That is why the drowning of this world feels so modern, without needing to force a crude parallel. The point is not their problem was our problem. The point is subtler. Humans are remarkably good at normalizing instability, especially when the change comes step by step. A coastline moves, a route fails, a margin narrows. The world still works, so you call it workable. Until one day, you realize you have been living on the remainder, not the whole. And once you see that, the final transformation of this place becomes even more astonishing. Because the same waters that covered a homeland also preserved enough of it that thousands of years later, the land can begin to rise again. Not from the sea, but in the mind. And that is the quiet miracle at the heart of this entire story. The sea buried a homeland, but it did not erase it completely. It pressed it flat, covered it, salted it, broke its visible shape apart, and still, enough remained that the land could be reconstructed from below, reassembled, not rescued. A line of old wet ground here. Woodland signals there. Traces of changing water. Evidence that the place linked Britain to mainland Europe when the seas were far lower, and evidence, too, that it was never just empty space waiting to drown. That matters because science, at its best, does something almost moral here. It gives back reality to people who left no written record. The old country does not return as legend. It returns as measured fact. Rivers, marsh, woodland, mammoths in older phases, then aurochs and red deer. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers living in a place rich enough to matter, then watching it narrow as the water kept rising, until little remained and the Storegga wave crossed the last low ground. That sequence is harsh, but it is honest, and honesty is what makes it powerful. Before we get to the final image this story leaves behind, pause on what has happened in your own mind. At the beginning, the North Sea may have felt like blank surface, just cold water over depth. Now it is layered. Under that surface lies an older arrangement of life, one with paths, edges, crossings, shelter, danger, and memory. You cannot see it with your eyes, but once you know it is there, the water stops feeling empty. That is the signature power of this kind of evidence-heavy mystery. It does not just answer a question. It changes what the ordinary world looks like afterward. A map is no longer innocent. A coastline is no longer fixed. Even silence is no longer simple, because the silence above this place is covering a great deal of human time. And that leads to the last movement of the story. If a drowned country can return this vividly through mud, pollen, and buried traces, then the final question is not only what was lost there, it is what exactly you are looking at now when you stand beside the sea and think you are seeing the whole world. And the honest answer is, you are almost never seeing the whole world. You are seeing the version of it that survived long enough to feel normal. That is what this drowned country teaches with such force. A calm horizon can hide a violent history. A familiar coastline can be the aftershape of a disappearance. Water can look empty while covering routes, wetlands, woodland, and the ordinary lives of people who once treated that same space as home. Practically, daily, completely, not mythically or symbolically. That is why the recovery of this place lands so hard. It does not ask you to believe in some unreachable ancient wonder. It asks you to revise something much more basic: your trust in surfaces. The sea surface says, there is nothing here but water. The buried evidence says, not true. The modern map says, this boundary is natural. The older landscape says, only if your memory starts late enough. Once those two layers sit together in your mind, the world becomes deeper and less innocent. Before we reach the final turn, stay with one image. Imagine standing at the edge of the North Sea on a cold day. Gulls crying, wind pressing your coat against your arms, the smell of salt and wet rope. To your eyes, the view is simple: gray water, gray sky, distance. But beneath that view lies a richer arrangement: former ground, former freshwater, former shelter, former crossings, and a whole sequence of retreat as rising meltwater seas narrowed the country until the last low remnants faced the Storegga wave. And what makes that image so powerful is more than the loss. It is the double vision science gives you afterward. You can look at the same water and hold two realities at once. The present one, visible and loud. The earlier one, buried and silent, but no less real for that. That, more than anything, is the emotional payoff of this mystery. Not simply learning that something vanished, but learning how thin the visible layer of your world really is. So now we are very close to the final question. If this place can be restored so vividly from mud, pollen, and the logic of a changing sea, then what remains after all the data, all the reconstruction, all the evidence is assembled? What is the one image of this drowned homeland that you carry with you when the water closes over it again? And maybe the image that stays is not the wave. Maybe it is something quieter than that. A strip of firm ground above wet reeds. A cold morning. Water lying farther inland than it used to. A route that still works, but only if you know exactly where to place your feet. Woodland behind you, open marsh ahead. The air carrying that faint salt edge that says the world is changing again. Just a place still alive, still useful, still loved, and already becoming harder to trust. That image matters because it holds the whole story without exaggerating it. This country was real land when the sea stood far lower. It linked Britain to mainland Europe. It held rivers, marsh, woodland, animal life, and people who knew how to live inside that richness. Then, rising water kept narrowing it. Then, the last low remains were struck by the Storegga wave. But between those facts lies something the evidence lets us feel, even when it cannot give us names. The experience of living on ground that is not gone yet, but is no longer fully keeping faith with the people on it. Before we reach the last movement, hold there for a breath, because that is where science becomes more than information. The seabed traces, the old buried signals of plant life, the reconstructed habitats, all of them lead not just to a lost map, but to a recovered human scale. The world beneath the North Sea was once walkable, habitable, familiar. Its disappearance was not abstract. It happened at the speed of choices, seasons, and returning memory. And the story does not end when the land goes under. In a strange way, it begins again there. The water closes over it, yes. The coasts we now call normal settle into place. The old connections vanish from sight. Centuries pass. Then millennia. And still, buried in the mud, enough remains to let the lost country press upward into thought once more. So when you carry one image away, maybe it is this. Not ruins beneath the sea, not a fantasy city, not a single great moment of destruction, but a human world still functioning on the edge of disappearance, while the water keeps coming, and the land is trying, for as long as it can, to remain a homeland. And in the end, the last image is not of a world vanishing. It is of one refusing, against enormous odds, to be entirely forgotten. Doggerland, the drowned world beneath the North Sea, does not come back to us as a legend with a single dramatic ending. It comes back the way real vanished things often do, in fragments that lock together so tightly they become undeniable. Lower seas revealing a broad lowland, rivers, marsh, and woodland giving it life, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers making a homeland there, rising water taking reliability first, then space, then connection. Storegga crossing the last low ground after the long retreat was already underway. And then, impossibly, the buried traces holding on long enough for the place to reappear in evidence. That is the resolution here. Recognition. The sea covered the paths, but it could not quite smooth out the memory of them in matter. A grain of pollen stayed where a tree once stood. Mud sealed the outline of wet ground. The old surface lay under cold water and waited. And thousands of years later, when people lowered tools into the seabed and brought up those quiet witnesses, the lost country opened again. Not under the feet, but in the imagination, with enough force to change the map in your head forever. Maybe that is the wisdom hidden in this story. Not every erased thing is gone. Sometimes the world keeps its own record in the smallest possible forms. A little sweetness in buried earth, a stain of marsh, a thin layer where fresh ground used to be. Then the image softens. Evening on the modern sea, wind flattening the waves, gulls turning once and then disappearing into the gray. Nothing rises from the water. Nothing announces itself. And yet, the silence no longer feels empty. If this episode stayed with you, subscribe and come back for the next one. There are more places like this, where the evidence is quiet and the implications are enormous. And if you ever find yourself looking out over a calm stretch of water, give it a second longer than usual. Sometimes the oldest landscapes are the ones you were never meant to notice at first glance.